that loud enough? Okay.
It's like this, right? We're here to gather together. There's fellowship and there's teaching, but we have a luncheon, right? In like 45 minutes, we're like, oh, I'm ready to eat. Like they went 3 days with probably just whatever little provision they had with them. And in their culture, they were used to having an empty belly. We're not used to that, right? Because they were a different kind of society. I mean, food didn't come, there was no H-E-B, corner market, Panera bread. It wasn't like, where are we eating today? Where are we having lunch today? What are we going to do for dinner? I mean, it was different. So, but after 3 days, right, they're hungry. They're becoming weak. And Jesus says, I have compassion on them. I care for them. I've fed them spiritually. I've nourished them spiritually, but I have compassion on their physical need also, right? Practically, we need to feed these people. And so we think for the disciples, this would be a no-brainer, right? When he asks to feed them, right? We would say, they would go, oh, we have 7 loaves of bread. This is great. There's only 4,000 people, and we have more bread than we did last time. This is great, right? And so wouldn't you think the response would be something like that? But instead, the response is, how can one satisfy these people in verse 4? With bread here in the wilderness. And you're like, this wasn't like years had passed since chapter 6, right? This is like months had passed. And Jesus' reply, he has so much mercy because he says to them, not like my reply, my face would be like, are you kidding me? But he just says, okay, how many loaves do you guys have? Isn't he so gracious and merciful? He has so much patience with them. But the question is, why didn't they have the faith? Why couldn't they say, why did they go, how are we going to do this in the wilderness? How can we feed these people? And I don't know, but I know if we look back, look at the children of Israel. How many things did they see? How many miracles did they experience? I mean, a pillar of fire led them by night and a cloud by day. Every morning they woke up and there was, bread from heaven just littering the ground, And I mean, how many things did they see? And then every time they couldn't see, what was their natural response? It was to doubt, right? It was unbelief. In your own life or my own life, how many times has God been faithful and provided and made a way? And then all of a sudden when there is no, you can't see, what do you say? What, right? So we can understand, I guess. In verse 6, it says, he commanded the multitude to sit down on the ground. He took the 7 loaves. He gave thanks. He broke them, and he gave them to the disciples. He fed 4,000 people with 7 loaves of bread. Wouldn't you have loved to see, what did that look like? How did it supernaturally isn't that amazing? I would have loved to see what that looks like. But when God wants to do something amazing, he always starts out with an impossibility. Doesn't he? When he wants to do something amazing, it starts with an impossibility. What does God say? With man, it's impossible, but with God, nothing is impossible. What does God say? Is anything too hard for me? I love those people because I'm not one of them, but when there's an impossible situation, they're like, this is great because God is going to show himself strong, and you're like, okay, you're right. I love those kind of people. I want to be that kind of person. But he provides, and he uses the disciples to hand out the bread. Isn't that sweet? He gives it to them, and they get to hand out and distribute this bread to the people, and he will use our lives the same way if we're available and just willing. He doesn't have to, right? He doesn't have to use us. We'll see in the end times in Revelation 14, he uses an angel to go around and proclaim the gospel to every corner, right? And he could do that now, but he chooses to use our lives if we are willing. And so he feeds the 4,000, and then immediately got into the boat with his disciples, verse 10, and came to the region of Dalmanutha. Then the Pharisees came out and began to dispute with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven, testing him. But he sighed, Jesus sighed deeply in his spirit and said, why does this generation seek a sign? Assuredly, I say to you, no sign shall be given to this generation. Now, these Pharisees are back at it. It says they're disputing with him and they're testing him. In the original language, it means to tempt. They're tempting God. They're saying, we want a sign from heaven. We want you to be verified before us. And we already know that Jesus had given them enough to know that he was the Messiah, right? They should know. Lepers are coming to the temple saying, we're here for the prescribed cleansing, and they're like, okay. I mean, that had never happened. They now have to go back and look, what did Moses say when a leper is cleansed? What are we supposed to do? I mean, the eyes of the blind are being opened. I mean, this is the Messiah is on the scene. They had seen enough, but they're saying, we just want to see a sign from heaven. And they don't want to see. People will say that, won't they? If you just show me a sign, then I'll believe. Is that true? I mean, it's not true. Look how much Pharaoh saw, right? Did he believe? Look, again, we go back to the children of Israel. That generation died in the wilderness in unbelief after all that they had seen. It doesn't produce a lasting faith. And in verse 12, it says that Jesus sighed in his spirit. And we talked about when he healed the man last week, right? It was last week he sighed. And we talked about how Jesus is not some far off, unfeeling God. But in that response, I think it was a sigh of like sadness, a sigh of compassion, a sigh of looking at this man, looking at all the destruction of sin, right, and what it causes and causes illness and disease, and he had that sigh. But here it's like a sigh of like, I don't know, isn't it more of like a sigh of grief over their rebellion and their sin? But he sighs in his spirit. And then it says he just leaves. He just turns and he just leaves. He gets on the boat and he leaves. Verse 14, now the disciples had forgotten to take bread. And they did not have more than one loaf with them in the boat, which seems like pretty good statistics, right? There's only 12 of them and one loaf, right? But then he charged them, saying, Jesus charged the disciples, saying, take heed, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And they reasoned among themselves, saying, it is because we have no bread. But Jesus, being aware of it, said to them, why do you reason because you have no bread? And do you not yet perceive nor understand? Is your heart still hardened? Having eyes do you not see, and having ears do you not hear? And do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many baskets full of fragments did you take up? And they said, 12. Also, when I broke the 7 for the 4,000, how many large baskets full of fragments did you take up? And they said, 7. So he said to them, how is it you do not understand? So Jesus begins by warning them of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And in those days, leaven, you would just take a pinch of the loaf of the dough. Just a pinch is all it would take to make the new batch rise. Just one little pinch, right? And in the Old Testament, it spoke of leaven as sin, and that's what he's talking about, that sin of unbelief, that sin of pride, right? Just a little bit can infect a large group, right? And he's warning them of this. And it says in verse 16, they begin to reason among themselves. Now, let's just take that as a warning. When we reason among ourselves and we leave God out of the equation, this is how ridiculous we get. Because they're like, oh, it's because we don't have bread. Back to the bread, all right? Like, is this like, you have a loaf of bread. Jesus can multiply bread. They're like, he's saying this because we forgot bread. But, just a lesson, we should never leave God out of the reasoning when we reason among ourselves. And Jesus asks them this, and he's saying to them, Why do you reason? Because you have no bread. Do you not perceive, nor you understand? Is your heart still hardened? He's asking them that, and because they should get it by now. They should be having understanding by now. And he says to them, he says, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember? Do you not remember? Forgetfulness and a hard heart are linked together. They are. When we forget, we become hard in our heart. We know that Paul, that Peter, that John, they're constantly reminding, aren't they? They're saying the same thing over and over and over. And why is that? Because we forget. And we need to be reminded. I don't know about you. I need to be reminded all of the time because I am prone to forget. Deuteronomy, my daughter sings, she's learning the books of the Bible, my 5-year-old, the Old Testament in school. So she says, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. So I always want to say that. But the cutest is when she goes, Lamentations, like tearing. It's just so cute. Anyway, so if you don't know your books of the Bible, we got to memorize them, right? I'm like, can you go through those minor prophets for me? Those are where she's like going through them. I'm like, I get stuck in those minor prophets. But Deuteronomy chapter 6, it says, now this is the commandment, and these are the statutes and judgments which the Lord your God has commanded to teach you, that you may observe them in the land which you are crossing over to possess, that you may fear the Lord your God, to keep all his statutes and his commandments, which I command you, you and your son and your grandsons, all the days of your life, that your days may be prolonged. Therefore, hear, O Israel, and be careful to observe it, that it may be well with you, and that you may multiply greatly as the Lord your God of your fathers has promised you, a land flowing with milk and honey. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength. And these words which I command you today shall be in your heart. And you, just consider this with me as we read them, and you think about your home and your marriage and your kids and your day in and day out. It says, you shall teach them diligently to your children, and you shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes, and you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. So it shall be, when the Lord your God brings you into the land which he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, to give you large and beautiful cities which you did not build, houses full of good things which you did not fill, hewn out wells which you did not dig, vineyards and olive trees, on and on he goes in verse 12. Then beware lest you forget the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And that's a caution to us. Lest we forget, because won't we forget? We forget God's past faithfulness, what he has done, what he's commanded. God tells you something. He says, he convicts you of something, and you're like walking in it, and then you just forget and stop walking in it. We forget. We forget the Lord. We forget what he's commanded us. And when we forget, we're prone to that hard heart. You think about these disciples. They had just seen Jesus feed 5,000 people with 5 loaves. A few months later, a difficult situation, they're like, how are we going to, we are the same way. But that's why we are to press into the Lord's heart every day, moment by moment. And then it goes on in verse 22. Then he came to Bethsaida, and they brought a blind man to him and begged him to touch him. So he took the blind man by the hand, and he led him out of the town. And when he had spit on his eyes, it's interesting, and he put his hands on him, he asked him if he saw anything. And he looked up, and he said, I see men like trees walking. Then he put his hands on his eyes again and made him look up. And he was restored and saw everyone clearly. And then he sent him away to his house, saying, neither go into the town nor tell anyone in the town. So this healing is only recorded here in Mark. It says that people bring this blind man to Jesus. So we don't even know if the blind man wanted to go, knew about Jesus, but they're bringing him to Jesus. And he leads him, that says, out of the town. And I don't know why he did that. Some suggest it was because by this time, Jesus had already prescribed judgment on Bethsaida. I don't know if you remember in Matthew 11, 20 through 22, he says, "Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! If the works that had been done in you were done in Tyre or Sidon, they would have repented in sackcloth and ashes. Woe to you." So I don't know, but nonetheless, he takes him out of the town, and he says, don't even go back into the town. But it says he spits, and we've seen that before. He spits. And some say this could have been because in some blindness, their eyes would be so gummed over, their lids would be so gummed together, that this was just like a natural touch from the Lord. Like he spits and he kind of is, taking out that gumminess of and I think, wow, that's really sweet. You know what I mean? That's really, because he didn't have to do that. Just like with the leper. He didn't have to touch that leper who was full of leprosy. I mean, can you imagine what that looked like? And Jesus didn't have to touch him first to heal him, right? But he touched him, and then he cleansed him. But nevertheless, I don't know, maybe it's just we know Jesus heals in many ways, but he spits. Okay, so he spits, and then he asks the man, do you see anything? And he's like, I see men walking like trees. And you're like, okay, what's going on? Does Jesus have not enough power? He's like, okay, that one didn't take. All right, what? And we know, that's not the case. Jesus is never limited in power. It wasn't like he was like, oh man, let's try this again, I'll have to touch him again. But he does. This is the first and only gradual healing we see, where Jesus actually touched somebody twice, because he wasn't healed completely the first time. But we know he doesn't need to heal gradually, but he does here. So why? I'm so sorry. I can't do that here. It was a late night with Harvest Festival, and then it was a late night. Sorry. Anyways, so some suggest maybe he's drawing out the faith of the man, which we see Jesus doing sometimes. We see Jesus kind of drawing out the faith, and I don't know. Is he teaching a lesson? I think there is a lesson to be learned here. I had a sweet sister share something that the Lord ministered to her, is that sometimes we don't see clearly, right? We lose our vision. We begin to see like foggy, and we need that extra touch from the Lord, right? And sometimes Jesus heals us gradually in things, right? We're not completely delivered, and we're like, Lord, touch me again. How many times do you have to do that? Lord, I just need that touch. Just need that touch. But he touches him again. And then we're going to go on. But after this verse 26 here, a line could be drawn. It's called the continental divide of the Gospels, because something changes at this point in the Gospels. Up to this point, Jesus' focus was on the masses, right? I've come to preach. I have come to teach them. This is what he did. He went from city to city, town to town, preaching, teaching, healing, and he was dealing with the masses. I mean, we saw long days and nights Jesus had of ministry, of pouring into people. But now there is a switch here at this point in the Gospels, and it's where he has set his eyes now on his disciples. It is his time now where he is just training them, pouring into them, and preparing them for what is coming, for his death and his burial and his resurrection. So he is now focusing on his disciples, pouring into them. Verse 27, it says, now Jesus and his disciples went out to the towns of Caesarea Philippi. And on the road he asks his disciples, saying to them, who do men say that I am? So they answered, John the Baptist, but some say Elijah, and others one of the prophets. And he said, but who do you say that I am? And Peter answered and said, you are the Christ. And then he strictly warned them that they should tell no one about him. So he asks the disciples, who do men say that I am? And it's not because he doesn't know, what is everybody saying about me? It's for their benefit, right? Of course, it's for them. And so there's no shortage of answers. Some say you're John the Baptist. Some say you're Elijah. Some say you're another prophet. And then Peter has this shining moment where he's like, you are the Christ. And we know in the other gospel that Jesus tells him, flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father from heaven. This is heavenly wisdom. This is a heavenly insight that you receive, Peter. So he declares, you are the Christ. And then Jesus continues, and he says, and he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. So he's beginning to teach them about the suffering that the Messiah would go through. And I wanted to read Isaiah 53, but we're getting tight on time. Go back and read through Isaiah 53, especially as we're preparing for our hearts for Christmas. And I just read it again this morning. But go back and read it, because at this time, the teachers were teaching only about the conquering Messiah, right? The Messiah is going to come. He's going to set up his kingdom. And everything about what the Messiah would suffer was left out, right? So he's having to teach his disciples, this has to come first. I'm going to suffer, and I'm going to die. And then we see that the scene here, which is crazy, it says he spoke this word openly, right? He's telling them openly what's going to come, what's going to happen. Then Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when he had turned around and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter, saying, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not mindful of the things of God, but of the things of man." So isn't this just, can you just imagine this with me? Peter may be a little puffed up because he's just received this, I have this heavenly, insight, and now I can come before Jesus and, tell him, because he literally takes Jesus and begins to rebuke him about the things that Jesus told him. Jesus is telling them about what the Messiah, what he would suffer and what's going to happen. And I don't know what Peter says, but he's rebuking him, saying, no, you're the Messiah, right? You're supposed to establish our kingdom. You're supposed to get rid of Rome. You're supposed to conquer. What are you talking about, right? So 1 minute he's speaking on behalf of God. You are the Christ. This is not flesh and blood. This is from my Father in heaven. The next minute he's speaking on behalf of Satan. It's crazy, because we can be saved and love God and still be used as a mouthpiece for Satan. We can. We don't have to be possessed by the devil to be used as his mouthpiece. And the problem was what he says to Peter, you are not mindful of the things of God, but you are mindful of the things of man. And we need to go, whoa, I don't ever want to be used as a mouthpiece for the enemy. And I'm sure I have in my life, in my Christian walk, when I am not mindful of the things of God, but I'm mindful of natural things. There's times we can give people ungodly advice, ungodly counsel. We can just reason among ourselves. We can say things that are divisive. We can say things that are just unkind. We can say things that tear, that don't help, that aren't helpful, but we just want to say them because we're, just fleshy. And we can be used in another to discourage somebody, to tear down somebody, to hurt somebody, to take somebody's eyes off of the Lord. Don't you want to go, whoa, I don't want to ever be used like that? But we can. We got to be so careful that we wouldn't be used as Satan's mouthpiece. And Jesus goes on. He wants to instruct his guys. He wants to instruct us. He says, when he called the people to himself with his disciples also, he said to them, whoever desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. This isn't like the most attractive sounding thing, to our flesh, right? He says, deny yourself, right? We don't really ever want to deny ourselves. We do deny ourselves when it kind of has a benefit, and this is a benefit, but we don't realize it. It is a benefit to deny ourselves, to deny our way of thinking, our rights, what we want to do. Romans 12, 1 through 2 talks about it, right? I'll just go ahead and read it. It says, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. We need to give our lives over as a living sacrifice and be renewed in our mind, because our natural thinking is not God's thinking. The way we think about things is not the way God thinks about things. He says, take up your cross. They would have understood this as a form of death, right? They don't understand yet quite Jesus going to the cross, but they'd understand take up your cross as a form of death row, right? Because that's what that's what they would do. They would take up their crosses. They're walking to death row. It speaks of death, right? And Jesus would say, we have to die. And there is that death that we have to have when, doesn't it take dying to ourselves when God asks us to do things like forgive? Doesn't that take death? You know, I have to die to forgive. I have to die to not retaliate. I have to die to remember, it's not the wrath of man that produces the righteousness of God, right? I have to die to kind of give that gentle answer sometimes. You know, there's that death, but in death there's life, because we say, my husband always will say, deny yourself, take your cross, what's left, right? Because isn't that what we feel like? What's left? What's left is following Jesus. And that's the great part. Following Jesus. We're following the good shepherd. Psalm 23. And if we feel like, what is left? If I deny myself, if I take up my cross, what is left? Following the good shepherd. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And then, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will not fear, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table for me in the presence of my enemy. You anoint my head with oil. My cup runs over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. What is left is following the good shepherd. Verse 35 says, and Jesus goes on, and he says, for whoever desires to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul? So Jesus is telling them, because we want to save our lives. We want to save, but he's saying, trying to save your life equals loss. Doesn't make sense to us, but believe Jesus. That's what he's saying. Try to save your life, it equals loss. He's saying losing your life for my sake equals gain. Just abandon, right? Abandoning our life for Jesus' sake and the gospel's equals gain. And Jesus says it in John 10. I came to give them life and life more abundantly. Not like a life more of a bummer, but abundant life he came to give, following him. And then he goes, what will it profit a man if he gains everything in this world, has everything, but in the end, right, our soul is eternal, and loses his own soul, his eternal destination. And then he ends by saying, and this is really, really heavy, for whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. Who is ever ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation? And we do live in a very adulterous and sinful generation, which is getting darker and darker, right? And we as Christians, and I know we live in this country where it was so easy for us, and it's not as easy for us to be a Christian anymore, but it's still way easier than anywhere else in this world. And we can be ashamed of Jesus. We shouldn't be, but I think every one of us could say, I think I can be ashamed of Jesus and his word, because if I wasn't, I would be sharing with everybody, right? There's just times, I mean, maybe you say, no, I share, so we can leave you out. But those of you that can identify with me will say, there are times that I just don't share. And why don't I share? Why do I not share? Because I'm embarrassed, or I care what somebody thinks of me? Why is it? Because I'm just not broken enough. I'm not broken enough for the lost. I am just not broken enough. And I just think, like, for all of us, like, I just feel like God wants to break our hearts for people and give us boldness and give us just a renewed boldness, because I know my boldness needs to be renewed. And so we are going to close right now, and Linda's going to sing one more song, and we're just going to get into an attitude of just humbleness before the Lord, whatever that looks like for you. Maybe that's just sitting right in your seat. Maybe that's like coming and kneeling down here. Maybe it's going in the back of the room. Maybe it's kneeling wherever you feel like, because we just want to quiet our hearts before the Lord and ask him that he would give us boldness to proclaim him with not being totally unashamed of him, but to be proud to go, you know what, I can share Jesus with you. I have hope for you. I have something good for you to share. This generation is lost, and they're getting more and more lost. So we'll just take this time during this song, and then we're just going to really cry out to the Lord and just ask him for some boldness.
Oh God, my Father, there is no shadow of turning with you. You never change, your compassions never fail. As you have always been, forever you'll be. Great is your faithfulness. Great is your faithfulness, morning by morning, new mercies I see. All I have needed, your hand provided. Great is your faithfulness, Lord, unto me. Summer and winter and springtime and harvest, sun, moon, and stars in the courses above, join with all nature in manifold witness to your great faithfulness, mercy, and love. Great is your faithfulness. Great is your faithfulness, morning by morning, new mercies I see. All I have needed, your hand provided. Great is your faithfulness, Lord, unto me. Great is your faithfulness. Great is your faithfulness, Lord, unto me. Pardon for sin and peace that endures, your own dear presence to cheer and to guide, strength for today and bright hope for tomorrow. Blessings are mine with 10,000 besides. Great is your faithfulness. Great is your faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. All I have needed, your hand provided. Great is your faithfulness, Lord, unto me. This is my testimony. This is your victory. Lord, have your way. This is your victory. Lord, have your way in me. Great is your faithfulness. Great is your faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. All I have needed, your hand provided. Great is your faithfulness, Lord, unto me. Great is your faithfulness. Great is your faithfulness, Lord, unto me. This is my testimony. This is your victory. Lord, have your way in me.
Father, I thank you that you say you give grace to the humble, and we ask that you just pour out your grace upon grace upon grace upon us. Lord, we need our love to be multiplied. We need just our mercy to be multiplied and our kindness to be multiplied. And Lord, we are living among a people and a generation who are so lost. Young people, so lost. They think they come from nothing and they're going nowhere. In this life, they can just live however because they're nothing more than an animal. Lord, we have young people identifying as inanimate objects or animals, or, Lord, so confused by their gender or who they are, God, because they don't understand that you made them. Fearfully and wonderfully they were created, and they are loved by you, and you have a plan for their life. And Lord, they're just all around us, God, and I just pray that you would break our hearts for the people around us, Lord. And God, that we would share the only prescription, the only hope, and that is you, Jesus. I pray that you would give us just that grace and that truth, Lord, to share, that we would share so sweetly like you do and so gracefully. We would always have the right word to say because we're just connected to you. Please help us. Lord, please, we cry out for our nation. Just ask, Lord, that you would heal our nation, God. We humble ourselves before you and ask, please heal our nation. Thank you that we can trust in your perfect plan, that you are sovereign. Lord, help us to be, Lord, on our face before you. Help us to be women that pray, women that are intercessors for others. Help us not to be so caught up in our little lives and world. Lord, you give us freely all things to enjoy, and we know you give us our family, you give us our things to enjoy, but God, you say seek first your kingdom and your righteousness, and then you'll take care of everything else. Help us, Lord, to be heavenly minded, to look to you, God, to have our priorities right, because God, they get so jacked up, at least in my life, Lord, so messed up. Help us to have right priorities, just to put you first. We just want to humble ourselves before you, Lord, because we know that blesses your heart. Lord, we know you desire to see us broken and humble, Lord, that you may give grace. God, just use us, Lord, as you did those disciples to distribute bread, Lord. Just do the impossible, Lord, and help us to be a part of your purposes and your plan. We just thank you. I thank you for these ladies. God, bless them in such a special way. God, bless their marriages and their homes, and just, God, heal, Lord, them from whatever hurts they have. Lord, heal their marriages. Lord, heal any broken